In today's video, we have two unexplainable stories. A story about a creature in the middle of nowhere, to a story about a town with a terrifying secret. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share these stories. Their links can be found in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, please be sure to drop a like and comment. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I wouldn't exactly refer to my life as normal, but what happened over the last 3 weeks is beyond my wildest nightmares, especially now that I type it all out. About a month ago, my grandfather passed away at the age of 74. From an apparent heart attack. My father, his son, had asked me to go over to see his estate while he was away overseas on a business venture. My grandfather had a large, ranch-style cottage in the middle of a stretch of plains in southern Colorado. I had never known my grandfather very well. The only times I ever got to see him was when he would come by my house and stay a night or two for the occasional holiday. Still, I loved him regardless. Me being the college kid that was about to take his summer break, I agreed to watch the cottage, if for nothing else but to get away from the university, and left only 2 days after the end of my semester. My little off-campus apartment could wait. It was only a few weeks after all. The trip there was relatively uneventful. Drive to this airport, fly out to this one, wait a couple hours and take the final plane to the closest airport from the cottage, some 80 miles away. The drive to the cottage was equally unassuming. Just miles of hills and grass, with the occasional mountain on the horizon. Still, I was excited to finally be out of that stuffy little college town. At least the air here didn't smell like gasoline and wet asphalt. When I finally pulled up to the cottage, I could barely tell if it was the right one. If it weren't for my grandfather's last name being printed on the mailbox by the dirt path leading up, I would have drove right by it. It was a medium-sized prairie home, with a faint, chipping blue paint on the wood siding that lined the sides of the house. Just to the side of the house was a big red barn, one that you would expect to see like in the movies. Always the red paint. I wonder why. The small ranch was fairly isolated. The dirt path that led away from the highway led on for at least a couple miles before ending here, at the cottage. I couldn't help but crack a smile. It was just like my grandfather to keep to himself. I stepped on the covered porch, and heard a deep creak in response. I heaved up my suitcase in one hand, and approached the front door. I stopped for a minute and studied it. There were 3 long gashes in the door, each about a centimeter deep. It was as if an animal tried to claw its way into the house. I shook myself from my curiosity. Surely there were wolves out here, right? I pushed open the front door, and it squealed a bit as it began to open up fully. The smell of the room suddenly hit me like a wave. The whole place smelled bad, but it was a faintly familiar smell. It had a smell similar to sulfur. Not exactly the most welcoming smell, but I pushed on anyways. It wasn't long before I settled in. I quickly found myself in a state of boredom. What did Grandpa do out here anyway? My cell phone had reception, but strangely didn't have any internet. I decided that the novels I brought with me were best saved for later. I poked around my grandfather's house to see if there was anything worthwhile. It wasn't long until I found an old radio sitting on the nightstand next to his bed. I was curious, so I tuned the old thing the best I could. I managed to find an old country music station, and the room filled with the shrill of a fiddle. I smiled again. Maybe a few weeks here wouldn't be so bad. I settled in for the night. I was suddenly awoken in my sleep by a loud howling. It seemed as if it were close. I peered out of the bedroom window to see the very wolves outside, maybe a couple 100 feet away from the porch, running through the grass away from the cottage. I gave a slight chuckle, remembering my close inspection of the scars on the front door. Yep, I laughed, in spite of myself. Definitely wolves. I fell back to sleep soon after. After a couple of rather uneventful days, I decided to check in with my father. I rang him up with my smartphone.
"Hey buddy, what's up?"
Came my dad's voice from the phone. Not a lot, to be honest. There isn't really much to do here, but I'm getting by. There's also this really bad smell that just doesn't seem to go away.
"Like sulfur?"
My father responded, "Yeah, like sulfur." I conceded.
"Well, your grandfather worked in a quarry for 20 years. They do say that smell never really goes away."
I guess not. The next day was equally uneventful. Another day of sitting around and reading novels, and another day of jamming out to old country hits. I started texting old friends, looking up fun recipes with the non-perishable supplies in the pantry, anything to escape the boredom. I began to really wonder what Grandpa did to escape the monotony of living so far from civilization. I thought it to be a great idea to wander around the ranch property. Around back was a desolate field, like it was once used for planting in a bygone time. I then wandered over to the barn, and pushed open the big door. The inside was large and mostly empty. It had seemed like there may have once been a second level, but it had long since been removed. Along the floor was hay strewn about, with a couple piles in the corners. Once again, my curiosity was captured. Why was there hay if there were no animals? One of the piles, however, seemed very strange. It had a flattened, pushed-in top, as if something had recently sat or laid on it. Out of curiosity, I reached out to touch it. It was warm. Someone had just been here. I frantically shot up out of the barn and ran around the side. Where were they? Why were they here? Were they a squatter of some sort, taking advantage of a recently abandoned property? My search yielded no answers. They were simply gone. Shook up from the incident, I made my way back to the cottage and called my dad. I explained to him what happened and why I was so shook up. He explained to me that there was nothing to worry about, and that my grandfather used to keep some horses. That explained the hay, but he never did quite reassure me about what was in there. That night, I was suddenly awoken again. I stopped for a second, anticipating the same howls from a few nights before, but none came. Then the radio, still sitting on the nightstand next to the bed, crackled on. Static flooded through the receiver at first. I sat there completely dumbstruck by what I had just witnessed. I sat there for a moment and attempted to rationalize the whole thing. Maybe it was just a faulty radio. Then a singing began to come through it. A soft woman's voice, faint, distant. It sounded like it was passionate, pained even. The words were incomprehensible. I stood up and approached the radio slowly, cautiously. I reached down to the outlet and unplugged it. The singing continued, not from the radio, but this time from outside the window. I froze. I had no idea what was going on. Terror flooded over me and I began to slowly step back. I pulled back the curtains and dared to look out the window. I couldn't quite make out a whole lot, but I began to scan the front yard, sweeping my gaze across the property. Then I saw it. The silhouette of a woman against the moonlight. No, this was no ordinary woman. The limbs and torso were elongated and thin, like stretched bone. It, hunched over with intent. Even still, her finger had to be nearly 7 feet tall. I shut the curtain and stepped away from the window. Oh God, what do I do? My first thought was to call the authorities. If at the very least to explain an instance of trespassing. I called the emergency line.
911, what's your emergency?
I believe there is a woman trespassing on my property.
Sir, have you attempted to interact with this woman?
No, I believe her to have some sort of malicious intent.
An officer has been dispatched to take care of the situation.
20 minutes. 20 agonizing minutes of waiting in that room, and waiting for the sirens. I tried to bring myself to look out of the window again, but I couldn't make myself do it out of fear of what I would see. So I stared at the bedroom door and waited. When the officer finally showed up, the woman was of course nowhere to be found. I explained the situation to him in detail, even going as far as to give the abnormal description of the woman I had witnessed. He raised his brow at me, his suspicion of the legitimacy of my story clear as day on his face. He jokingly asked me if I was prone to nightmares, but when he saw I was not amused, he quickly backpedaled, stating that if there was anything else suspicious to not be afraid to call. He was gone within another 5 minutes. Great. Several days more passed. Sleeping at night had become more of a chore because of that strange incident, but nothing had happened since. I was obviously less upbeat about the prospect of staying there for another week and a half, but I did not know what else I could do. I was the one entrusted to watch the estate. Maybe I could shrug off a few nightmares, right? That night I woke up in the middle of the night again, and again there was singing, this time louder, more clear. It was coming from right outside the window. I pulled myself out of bed, the same familiar terror flooding through my body. But I was filled with a sick curiosity, and I reached for the curtain and pulled it back. I closed the curtain quickly in a reaction of fear. She was just outside the window, on the porch, but that was no woman, not even close. Instead of a woman's face, I stared into an empty gaze. There were no eyes, only voids where eyes were supposed to be. The mouth was permanently fixed in a screaming expression. The skin looked blackened, twisted, and burned. The stringy hair floated around the skeletal head. The skin of the lanky, slim limbs clung tightly to contorted bone. And that thing was just outside of my window. I ran and immediately locked the bedroom. The singing outside had stopped, this time replaced by shrills and frantic skittering. There were loud scratching noises from where the front door was. Desperate, long scratches that audibly ripped away wood from the front door. She's trying to claw her way in. Frantically, I barricaded the bedroom door with the little furniture in the room. I reached for my phone and immediately rang the police. Another agonizing 20 minutes. This time, the scratching continued. The shrills outside became more desperate. I had never been more terrified in my life. I heard the front door begin to crack, ready to give way. And sirens. Thank God. The scratching stopped, and I could hear the thing skitter off the porch, and listen to it becoming more faint. The officer took me serious this time. How could he not? The front door was now completely splintered, barely still hanging on the hinges. I could still tell, however, that he doubted the truth of what he was seeing. He called for an additional car, and together they did a deep search of the perimeter. Of course, they came up with nothing. Now taking my claim seriously, I helped him fill out a report of the situation. He recommended that I be cautious. Right, as if I didn't know that already. Again, I watched him drive away. I slept in a barricaded room that night. A few more nights passed. Now, it was only 3 days before my father returned from overseas. I thought many times about telling him about the situation, but if I couldn't explain the situation to the police, who had witnessed what had happened to the front door, how could I convince someone of the facts half the world away? Regardless, I had one resolution. I had to leave, and soon. That day I had decided to call it quits. I couldn't just wait for the thing to come back. I went out to my car and put in the key. I turned it, but instead of the roar of the engine, I was met with a pathetic sputtering before shocked silence. I went out to the front and the hood of the car to try and determine the issue. I opened it up. The battery wires were cut, or rather slashed. Then a repeating shrill came from the thick wilderness of the trail leading back to the highway. It was a mockery of laughter. It was toying with me, daring me to make a run for it. I made a break for the house, and even though I didn't hear anything following, I kept sprinting. Rushing past the kitchen, I ripped open a drawer and picked out the largest kitchen knife I could find. I barricaded what remained of the front door, then barricaded myself once more in the bedroom. I once again broke out my trusty cell phone, dialed 911, and no answer. I was awestruck. I couldn't believe it. I tried again. No answer. I tried to reach my father with similar results. I sat there, a whirlwind of fear, anger, and imminent doom swirled around in my head. I cried for a long time, completely helpless. Nightfall came not too long after. I sat on the bed, staring at the bedroom door. A sick sense of anticipation filled my body. It was coming. I know it. There was nothing I could do about it, and the thing knew it. Then the singing started, once more. This time I could make out the words. It was my name, over and over, sung out in a long melody so as to not be clear. I realize now what it was. It wasn't just some arbitrary song. It was calling me. Then the scratching started once more. Slow this time, less desperate. I knew it had all night. So I sat there for hours, listening to the scratching. The shrills became twisted cackles as the front door finally gave in to the monster. I heard it skitter to the bedroom door. Suddenly the smell that I had been so accustomed to had become more intense. Sulfur. It was coming from the creature. It must have been in the house before. Maybe my grandfather's death wasn't as natural as we all thought. Suddenly the thing broke through a piece of the bedroom door, its claw finally breaking to the other side of the doorknob. Seeing the opportunity, I raised a large kitchen knife and brought it down on that twisted claw. It went right through the hand and stuck in the door. The thing was completely unfazed. It was as if it wasn't there, and I had swung the knife at open air. The creature leaned down and stared at me through that hole with the same empty, haunting gaze that I had met with nights before. I was petrified with fear, managing only to get out a single word. Why? It seemed to like that. It gave a couple more mocking chuckles, and pulled back from the hole, gave a cackling shrill, and scattered out the front door. That was last night. Now it has become more brave. I heard the shrills all day, all surrounding the house. I can't leave. I'm trapped, stuck, like wounded prey waiting for the predator to end the game. Make it stop, please. I know it's playing with me now. Waiting. Just waiting. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry. As much as I would like to think that I am going to be okay, the dark reality of my situation sets in farther. I still have the kitchen knife. The closer the shrills get, the more uncertain I get. What do I do? What can I do? Should I try to fight it again? Should I get out of this nightmare right now? I don't know. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That's strange. The shrills have stopped, but I can still hear skittering. Closer. Ever closer. The scratching has started again. Forgive me. My grandfather remembered the last shadow spring. He told me it happened when he was just a boy, 108 years old, and he shared his recollection with me as though it had happened in recent memory. He told it as spry and coherent as he'd ever told me anything. Bradenville is a small town, the type of place where everybody knows your name and rumors run unchecked. Everyone here has heard of the last shadow spring. It's a ghost tale all of the parents here tell to keep their children in line. You have to stop playing out on Mr. Josiah's farm, a mother will say as she tucks her little one into bed. It's almost planting season. If you don't behave, the shadow ones will take you. Do you remember the story of the shadow ones? The child will hesitate with covers pulled up to their chin, not wanting to provide an answer to the question. The dark ones are the ones who make the crops not grow, the mother will say. They'll make the corn stalks stunted and short, and the beans won't sprout. She'll pause in the telling for effect before asking, "What else do they do?" The child will hesitate, not wanting to answer, but the mother will wait until the uncomfortable silence penetrates even the protective covers of the comforter pulled to their chin. They take the bad little boys and girls to the shadow fields. Eventually they'll reply. The mother will nod then. "That's right," she'll say. "And what happens to the children taken off to the shadow fields?" She'll ask. Nobody knows. The child will answer. She'll nod. "Oh, but they do. At least they think they know." She'll pause again for more effect, hoping the message will sink in and that her child will behave once and for all. What do they think happens to the children once they become swallowed by the shadows? She'll ask. They'll tend the fields forever. The child will reply, but nothing will ever grow. If it does grow, it doesn't grow the same. That's right. She'll say, at least that's what they think will happen. The last shadow spring happened over 100 years ago. Your grandfather remembers, because he was a good little boy. That's why they didn't take him. You need to be a good little boy too, understand? And the child will nod and his mother will cut the light on the bedside table, and with a parting kiss, she'll leave the room. I remember my own mother telling me that story when I was very young, and that's exactly how the exchange went, insofar as I can recall. My grandfather lived to the ripe old age of 111. It was almost unheard of. He didn't lose any of his mental faculties. Until the day he died, he was coherent. His last words were even a final complaint about the way that his nurse was constantly popping her gum. Pop hated gum for as long as I could remember. We were never allowed to have it any time he was around. He said that it was something that irresponsible people did, chewing gum. That's why you could always find it on the bottoms of restaurant tables. Why you should expect to find yourself stepping in it at any moment. Inappropriately discarded on the ground. As an adult, I discounted most of the things he said as the nonsensical ravings of those of a man of a certain age. I chose not to threaten my own son with Shadow Springs. He was well behaved enough, and the rest of the town may be keeping the tradition alive. But as for me, I was ready to let it die. Nobody had seen a true Shadow Spring in over a century. That is, if they happened at all. I began to question the logic. Sound, though, as I may have considered it earlier this month. Children in Bradenville had begun disappearing, and the stories we were told as kids seemed to fit the ball of the formula we were taught to avoid. I didn't want to tell my own son this, because it felt like an old legend, without much merit to qualify it. Then his friend Caleb Cole disappeared. The last place he'd been seen was somewhere near the old Josiah farmstead. He'd apparently been riding his bike, off-road, through the freshly tilled dirt of that old field. Who tilled that dirt to begin with? Nobody could say. That old farmhouse and the land that surrounded it had been abandoned in the 90s. It stood abandoned even when I was just a kid his age myself. I didn't put much stock in the old legend, or the disappearance of my son's friend, until the day that all the birds took flight from the trees that surrounded that old, discarded land. All at once, they took to the air, squeaking and squawking as they abandoned their homes. All flew in the same direction, as quickly as they could get away from the place, and whatever seemed to have begun to happen there. The rabbits and deer were next, leaping on mended fences and sprinting across busy highways. All of the native fauna seemed intent on escaping this place. I passed those abandoned acres every day, overgrown and unattended for as long as I could remember. Then one day the overgrowth was cleared and the ground was tilled. It was that day that I first noticed the animals, large and small. as they began to flee those accursed acres. Grandfather told me that was how it all started in the times that he could remember. The recollection of the story hit me the day the birds took to sky, in an unnatural band of multicolored feathers. They weren't of the same species or ilk, yet they'd left altogether, and all at once, all the same. This was a field where nothing could ever grow, no matter how hard that the Josiahs tried to recover it and plant, and now a boy was missing. But my Jacob was a good boy. It took some time, but I'd managed to convince myself there was little to worry about. Around the same time that Caleb disappeared, his dreams began. He began to wake after midnight, screaming in the dark about the shadows. "No!" he screamed. The sheets would be knotted at his feet, and his skin, soaked in sweat, was clammy and cold. This went on for weeks. More and more children disappeared. The next to go was Hillary next door. Her mother Janet told me that she watched it happen. She said she watched Hillary climb up to the roof of their old farmhouse and jump. There was no impact with the ground, no sound to indicate that she'd landed. Her mother told me that shadows seemed to have formed, like a dark swirling mist that swallowed up the light of their porch lamps and bathed the ground below in darkness. When Hillary jumped, she disappeared into the dark mist. Janet said the mist dissipated, and she watched her daughter's shadow move across the ground, cast by a form that could be seen. The shape of her daughter walked slowly into the fields. She watched her recede from view until she reached the tree line and disappeared. It had taken her a long time to call the police and report the incident. More than likely, this was because of the shock of seeing something so preternatural and unlikely before her very eyes as it unfurled. She told me she could tell the police suspected her of foul play, but without evidence to corroborate their suspicions, she wasn't charged with any crime. This continued throughout the last month. Seedlings that had begun to sprout in the month prior began to wither and die without explanation. When the deer began to emerge from the forests around town, I began to know for sure that the shadow spring was real. The things that came out from the trees could barely be described as deer at all. Not anymore. They were skeletal things. Some missing eyes, most missing skin. Several hobbled out from the trees with broken legs that soon fell away from their bodies, and the creatures that remained hobbled along through the deadened fields, three-legged or worse. Crawling along the ground, they dug the hooves that remained into the earth before them, and dragged themselves to the lights of the nearest homesteads. Many of the farmers claimed to have seen them coming. Many claimed to have shot them over and over again in the dark. Nothing seemed to stop them. The news claimed they were victims of the wasting disease plaguing many of the animals in the area. They urged the people in town not to eat the meat of any of the deer they killed. Not that anyone would. Those that were lucky enough to emerge from the shadows of the trees were more often than not marred and scarred by tumorous growths that covered most of their faces. Even those that were not entirely whole had the same goiters throughout their bodies. The first thing that died on our land was the begonias that his other father had planted outside of our front door. They died even before the shadow spring took our son, before he even jumped like the others. It was like something that had crept there in the night and made them curl into nothing. I should have warned Jacob throughout his life, like my mother had done for me. I didn't accept what was going on in Bradenville, until I found Jacob on the roof on the last night that I saw him alive. Like Hannah, he jumped from the highest height of our home, diving into the waiting pool of shadows below. Marshall stood there with me watching. We tried to stop him, but we'd seen him too late. We'd only awoken in the last moments as Jacob tread heavily on the roof above our bedroom. By the time we'd made it outside, he was already at the edge of the awning, precariously balanced on the limit of the shingles, perched at the final edge of a 2-story drop-off. We called out to him in the dark. We'd begged him to take a step backwards and climb back inside through his bedroom window, and then he was gone. My husband Marshall and I were baffled when we came out the next morning, our eyes still puffy from lack of sleep. and a night of confused crying, and all of his flowers were shriveled and dead. "Scott?" he asked. "What's happening?" Marshall wasn't from here. He was from the city. He'd never heard the small-town legends that we'd all grown up with. I tried to explain it all to him without sounding ridiculous. I could tell he didn't believe me. The next to go were the flowers in the boxes at the window. After that, the vining plants that hung in baskets on our porch. Leaving Bradenville was not an easy choice. But slowly the town was turning black. Slowly the plants were withering and dying and turning to dust, to be blown away on even the most gentle of breezes. Slowly the plants all faded and wilted to dust and began to blow away, out to litter the dead fields that would not yield crops this year, not with the shadow spring unfolding at full swing. Before long, the police began to find the parents of those missing children, withered and mummified against the frames of their bones. Marshall and I decided it was time to leave. We left town, packing nothing, leaving our house fully furnished, and most of our belongings behind. We planned to return in the fall and remove it all, take it all someplace else, someplace where these things didn't happen. We never wanted to abandon Jacob to the shadows, but there was little we could do to save him. I'm still unsure where we went wrong. We thought that Jacob was the best child that two fathers could have asked for. We had no idea of the things he was doing behind our backs. We only learned as things began to grow worse, and the rest of the town began to grow more malicious in their words and actions. Most of the town seemed to believe that he was just a cog in the giant catalyst machine. We heard he cheated on a math test, and we heard he'd stolen money from another kid's wallet. We wondered if any of that was true. We wondered at the same time whether or not his heart and thoughts were impure. Perhaps he dreamt of murder and hurting those around him. If that was the case, then perhaps it didn't matter. Maybe he was targeting us this entire time. The answer didn't matter. Whatever the case, the shadows had come, and in this town, nothing would be allowed to grow. We felt what remained of our hope wither from green to black. It blowed away in the wind in a cloud of ash as we got into the car and left this place behind us in the dust. We couldn't risk the darkness of the shadow spring finding us like it had those other parents. We couldn't risk it drying us to husks, or the two of us turning to piles of ash to be carried away on the wind with the rest of them.